I stood in the executive parking garage of Sterling Financial Solutions, clutching my new promotion letter as Senior Operations Manager, when the arrogant new regional director screeched his gleaming black BMW into the space marked Reserved and Sterling. Brad Thompson stepped out, assumed I was valet service, and hurled his keys at my feet while bellowing, "Park my BMW, valet!" When I refused and let those keys clatter onto the concrete, his face turned crimson with rage.
"Pick them up!"
he screamed. Just then, a tow truck rumbled up the ramp. The driver leaned out his window and called to me, "Boss, which cars are we repossessing today?" I pointed directly at that pristine BMW. "Start with that one. It's parked in my spot." The look of absolute confusion on Brad Thompson's face almost made me laugh. He stood there gaping like a fish out of water, while the tow truck driver Tony Rodriguez from Atlas Recovery Services began hooking chains to his precious BMW. What Brad didn't know was that I wasn't just another employee he could bully and humiliate. I owned 51% of Sterling Financial Solutions. 6 months ago, my grandfather, Harold Sterling, lay dying in his hospital bed at Cedar Grove Medical Center. His weathered hands gripped mine as he whispered the secret that would change everything. "Nellie, sweetheart, you're my only heir. The company is yours now, but don't tell anyone yet. Work there first. Learn the business from the ground up. See what's really happening behind closed doors." Grandfather Harold had built Sterling Financial from nothing back in 1978. He started with a tiny office above Murphy's Deli on 3rd Street and grew it into the most respected investment firm in the Tri-County area. But his final years had been plagued by health problems, and he'd grown suspicious that something wasn't right with the company's finances. So I'd taken his advice. For 6 months, I'd worked as a regular employee using my middle name Nelson on all the paperwork to hide my connection to the Sterling family. I started in customer service, then moved to data entry, and finally worked my way up to operations. Every day I watched. Every day I learned. And every day I discovered more evidence that Sterling Financial was being systematically destroyed from the inside. The corruption started at the top with CFO Marcus Webb, a slick-talking snake who'd somehow convinced the board to hire Brad Thompson 2 weeks ago without proper background checks or authorization. Marcus had been skimming money for months, but Brad's arrival had accelerated the theft to shocking levels. I'd secretly partnered with Atlas Recovery Services weeks ago, knowing this moment would come. Tony Rodriguez and his crew weren't just repo men. They were licensed private investigators who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Every conversation, every illegal transaction, every forged signature had been carefully documented.
"Wait just a damn minute,"
Brad sputtered, his designer suit wrinkled from his dramatic gesturing.
"You can't just steal my car. I'll call the police. I'll sue this whole place into the ground."
Sarah Martinez, my loyal assistant who was one of only 3 people who knew my true identity, stepped forward with a manila folder thick with legal documents.
"Mr. Thompson, I believe you'll find everything is perfectly legal. Ms. Sterling owns this company, and you've been parking in her designated space for 14 days.
Brad's jaw dropped so far I thought it might unhinge completely. He grabbed the documents from Sarah's hands, his eyes scanning frantically over incorporation papers, ownership certificates, and board resolutions that clearly established my majority control of Sterling Financial Solutions.
"This is impossible,"
he whispered, his arrogance crumbling like a house of cards. "The board hired me. Marcus Webb personally recruited me from Goldman Sachs. I have a 5-year contract worth $750,000 annually."
"Your contract was signed by Marcus Webb without board authorization,"
I said calmly, watching his BMW disappear onto the tow truck.
"Since you never had legal authority to work here, your employment is immediately terminated. Security will escort you from the building once we finish our conversation."
The color drained from Brad's face as the full implications hit him. He'd been bragging for 2 weeks about his big promotion, his signing bonus, his corporate credit cards. Now he was learning it had all been an elaborate fraud orchestrated by a corrupt CFO who was about to face his own reckoning. But what Brad didn't realize was that losing his job and his car were the least of his problems. My 6 months of undercover investigation had uncovered crimes that went far beyond simple embezzlement. I'd discovered a web of financial fraud so extensive that it threatened the retirement savings of over 3,000 clients. As Tony's tow truck pulled away with Brad's status symbol, I smiled grimly. The real justice was just beginning. That evening, long after the last employee had gone home, I made my way to my grandfather's private office on the 7th floor. Hidden behind a mahogany bookshelf was a steel door that required both a key and a 6-digit code. Inside, Grandfather Harold had built his own private command center, complete with surveillance monitors, financial databases, and secure filing cabinets containing decades of company records. The surveillance system he'd installed captured everything. Every conversation in the executive conference room, every transaction at the financial terminals, every after-hours meeting between corrupt employees. What I discovered that night made my blood run cold. Brad Thompson had stolen $312,467 in exactly 14 days. The money had been siphoned through phantom consulting contracts with a shell company called Thompson Advisory Group, incorporated in Delaware just 3 weeks before Brad's mysterious hiring. The contracts were for services that never existed. Market analysis reports that were never written, client acquisition strategies that were never implemented, risk assessment studies that were never conducted. But the surveillance footage revealed something even more sinister. Brad hadn't been working alone. CFO Marcus Webb had been coaching him through every illegal transaction, teaching him which accounts to target and how to forge the necessary authorizations. Their conversations, recorded in crystal clear digital audio, laid out a conspiracy that stretched back months before Brad's arrival. "The Patterson account is perfect." Marcus's voice crackled through the speakers as I watched week-old footage. 78-years-old widowed trusts us completely with her late husband's pension fund. She never checks the statements we mail her. We can move $200,000 without her noticing for at least 6 months. Evelyn Patterson. I remembered her from my customer service days. A sweet grandmother who came in once a month to deposit her Social Security check and ask about her investments. She'd worked as a school cafeteria manager for 30 years and lived on a modest fixed income. Her late husband, Walter, had been a telephone company lineman who'd saved every penny to ensure she'd be comfortable in retirement. The thought of these predators stealing from a vulnerable elderly woman filled me with rage so intense I had to step away from the monitors. But I forced myself to keep watching, to keep documenting. Mrs. Patterson wasn't their only victim. Over the past 6 months, Marcus and Brad had targeted 18 elderly clients, systematically draining accounts belonging to retired teachers, former factory workers, and disabled veterans. They'd chosen victims who rarely checked their statements, who trusted Sterling Financial implicitly, who wouldn't notice gradual withdrawals disguised as portfolio rebalancing fees and market volatility adjustments. The surveillance also revealed another key player in their scheme, Jake Sullivan from the accounting department. But unlike Marcus and Brad, Jake wasn't a willing participant. I watched footage of him questioning suspicious transactions, expressing concerns about irregular paperwork, and being threatened with termination if he didn't stay quiet. Jake had been trying to blow the whistle for weeks, but Marcus had convinced him that upper management was already investigating and that speaking out would jeopardize the investigation. It was a lie designed to buy time while they moved as much money as possible before anyone caught on. Around 2 a.m, I discovered the most shocking evidence yet. Hidden in Marcus's computer files was a detailed plan to frame me for the entire embezzlement scheme. They'd planned to plant fabricated evidence on my workstation, create fake email threads suggesting I'd masterminded the theft, and present their findings to the board at an emergency meeting scheduled for Friday afternoon. Their plan was brilliant in its simplicity. By the time the meeting ended, I'd be fired in disgrace, probably facing criminal charges while Marcus and Brad disappeared with millions of stolen dollars. The shell company accounts would be closed, the money transferred to untraceable offshore accounts, and Sterling Financial would be left bankrupt and ruined. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They assumed the board of directors would support their version of events without question. What they didn't know was that I'd already used my majority ownership to quietly replace every single board member over the past month. Gone were the old cronies who'd rubber-stamped Marcus's decisions without oversight. In their place, I'd appointed retired federal judge Patricia Wells, former FBI white-collar crime investigator Robert Chen, and Dr. Angela Foster, a nationally recognized expert in business ethics and corporate governance. Friday's emergency board meeting was going to be very different from what Marcus and Brad expected. But first, I had one more call to make. I picked up the secure phone in Grandfather's office and dialed a number I'd memorized weeks ago. Agent Morrison. This is Nellie Sterling. I think it's time we moved forward with the operation we discussed. Yes, I have enough evidence now. Plan on Friday afternoon. They're going to try to frame me, but we'll be ready for them. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching the ominous mood that had settled over Sterling Financial Solutions. Word of Brad's car being repossessed had spread through the office like wildfire, generating dozens of whispered conversations and nervous glances. Most employees sensed that something big was about to happen, but none of them knew exactly what. I arrived early and made my way through the building, checking in with key personnel who'd proven their loyalty during my undercover months. Sarah Martinez had already secured all the important files in Grandfather's hidden office. Jake Sullivan from accounting was nervous, but ready to testify about what he'd witnessed. Even the security guard's longtime company veterans who'd worked for Grandfather Harold were prepared for whatever might unfold. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Marcus Webb burst into my temporary office on the third floor, his normally perfect hair disheveled and his expensive silk tie askew. Behind him lurked Brad Thompson, who'd somehow acquired an ill-fitting rental suit to replace his usual designer wardrobe. Both men wore expressions of barely contained excitement like predators closing in on wounded prey.
"Nellie, we need to talk,"
Marcus announced, not bothering to knock or wait for permission to enter.
"We've discovered some very serious irregularities in the company's financial records, and unfortunately all the evidence points to you."
Brad stepped forward, holding a manila folder stuffed with what I knew had to be fabricated evidence. His smug grin suggested he was savoring this moment of revenge for the humiliation he'd suffered 3 days earlier in the parking garage.
"We found these files on your computer,"
Brad said, dumping the contents onto my desk. Fake vendor contracts, forged signatures, unauthorized wire transfers totaling over $400,000. "We've already called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon to discuss your immediate termination and possible criminal prosecution." I picked up one of the documents and examined it carefully. The forgery was actually quite sophisticated, complete with letterhead from Thompson Advisory Group, and what appeared to be my electronic signature authorizing payment for consulting services. They'd even created fake email threads, showing me supposedly coordinating with offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. "This is very impressive work," I said, calmly setting the papers aside.
"You must have spent considerable time preparing all this evidence."
Marcus leaned back in his chair, radiating confidence.
"Nellie, I want you to know this gives me no pleasure. You seemed like such a dedicated employee. But when money starts disappearing, we have to follow the trail wherever it leads. I'm sure you understand."
Oh, I understand perfectly, I replied. In fact, I think this afternoon's board meeting will be very educational for everyone involved. What Marcus and Brad didn't realize was that while they'd been busy fabricating evidence against me, I'd been preparing my own surprise for the board meeting. The 3 new board members I'd appointed were already in the building reviewing the mountains of authentic evidence I'd gathered during my investigation. At 2 o'clock sharp, we all gathered in the executive conference room on the 8th floor. The space had been Grandfather Harold's pride and joy, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown district and a massive oak table that could seat 20 people. Today it would seat 8 myself. Marcus Brad, the 3 new board members, Sarah Martinez as recording secretary and Jake Sullivan as a witness. Marcus called the meeting to order, unaware that he no longer had any authority to do so. He launched into a prepared presentation about the serious financial crimes I'd supposedly committed using a PowerPoint slideshow, complete with charts and graphs showing money flowing into fake accounts.
As you can see,
Marcus concluded dramatically, Ms. Nelson has systematically looted client accounts for her personal gain. I recommend immediate termination and referral to federal authorities for prosecution. Brad nodded enthusiastically.
the evidence is overwhelming.
We should also consider filing a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds before she can hide them overseas. Judge Patricia Wells, a distinguished woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, spoke for the first time. Mr. Webb, before we proceed, I think there are some facts you should know about this board's composition. Marcus frowned. I'm sorry, but who are you exactly? I don't recall approving any new board appointments. I'm retired federal Judge Patricia Wells, she replied evenly. I was appointed to this board 3 weeks ago by majority shareholder Nellie Sterling, along with my colleagues here, former FBI Special Agent Robert Chen and Dr. Angela Foster from the American Institute of Business Ethics. The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications became clear. Brad's mouth fell open, his confident expression replaced by growing panic. Robert Chen, a tall Asian American man with graying temples, opened his laptop computer.
Mr. Webb, we've spent the past week reviewing the real financial records of this company.
The actual evidence tells a very different story from the one you've just presented. Dr. Foster, an African-American woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, spread a different set of documents across the conference table. What we've found is a sophisticated embezzlement scheme involving phantom consulting contracts, forged authorizations, and the systematic theft of client funds. But the perpetrators aren't who you've identified. Marcus tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to buckle beneath him. Brad looked toward the conference room door as if contemplating escape, but Sarah Martinez had positioned herself strategically to block the exit.
I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding,
Marcus stammered. These board appointments aren't valid. The proper procedures weren't followed. Judge Wells smiled coldly.
Mr. Webb, I've reviewed all the documentation.
Ms. Sterling's majority ownership gives her absolute authority to restructure this board. Everything was filed properly with the State Corporation Commission. That's when I finally spoke up. Marcus Brad, I want you both to know that everything you've said in this room today has been recorded. Your confessions about framing me for crimes you committed will be very useful to federal investigators. The conference room door opened and Jake Sullivan entered, carrying boxes of financial records and computer hard drives. Behind him walked Agent Rebecca Morrison from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, along with 2 other federal agents I didn't recognize. Mr. Webb,
Mr. Thompson,
Agent Morrison announced. You're both under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit federal financial crimes. The transformation in the conference room was immediate and devastating. Marcus Webb, who'd entered the meeting radiating arrogant confidence, now sat slumped in his chair as Agent Morrison read him his Miranda rights. Brad Thompson frantically pulled out his cell phone, presumably trying to delete incriminating evidence. But Agent Chen quickly confiscated the device before he could destroy anything. "This is insane!" Brad shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's the criminal! We have proof! Look at those documents!" Agent Morrison examined the fabricated evidence Brad had presented earlier, then set it aside with obvious disdain. "Mr. Thompson, creating false evidence is a federal crime in itself. You've just added obstruction of justice to your charges." What followed was a masterclass in federal law enforcement efficiency. Within minutes, additional FBI agents swarmed through Sterling Financial Solutions, securing computers, seizing files, and interviewing employees. The investigation I'd been conducting secretly for weeks had provided them with enough probable cause to execute search warrants covering every aspect of the company's operations. Sarah Martinez escorted the agents to Marcus's office, where they immediately discovered additional evidence of the conspiracy. Hidden in his desk drawer were blank signature cards for client accounts, forged board resolutions, authorizing major transactions, and handwritten notes detailing which elderly clients would be most vulnerable to theft. But the real breakthrough came when Agent Morrison's cybercrime specialists cracked Brad's laptop password. What they found exceeded even my worst expectations. Brad hadn't just been stealing from Sterling Financial clients. He'd been running the same scam at 3 other investment firms over the past 2 years, systematically targeting elderly investors across multiple states. "We're looking at wire fraud across state lines," Agent Morrison explained to me as we watched Brad being led away in handcuffs. "Bank fraud, securities fraud, elder abuse, tax evasion, and money laundering. This isn't just a local embezzlement case anymore. It's part of a multi-state organized crime investigation." The scope of Brad's criminal enterprise was staggering. The forensic accountants discovered that he'd stolen over $1.7 million from elderly clients in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia before arriving at Sterling Financial. Each time he'd used the same pattern charm his way into a financial firm, identify vulnerable elderly clients, systematically drain their accounts, then disappear before anyone noticed the missing money. Marcus Webb, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, immediately began cooperating with investigators. He confessed that Brad had approached him 6 months ago with a detailed plan to loot Sterling Financial's client accounts. In exchange for providing inside access and technical expertise, Marcus was supposed to receive 30% of the stolen funds. "He told me Sterling Financial was perfect," Marcus admitted during his interrogation, which I was allowed to observe through a one-way mirror. "Old client base, minimal oversight, outdated computer systems. He said we could steal millions before anyone noticed." The confession revealed that they'd been planning to frame me from the very beginning. Brad had researched grandfather Harold's death and discovered that I was his only heir. Their plan was to steal as much money as possible, then pin the blame on the grieving granddaughter who'd started working at the company shortly after the founder's death. But their scheme had a fatal flaw. They'd underestimated both my intelligence and my grandfather's foresight. The hidden surveillance system, the detailed financial records, and the new board of directors had turned their trap into a snare that caught them instead. By evening, the FBI had traced the stolen funds to bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore. Working with international law enforcement partners, they'd already frozen over $2 million in recovered money. The process of returning funds to victimized clients would begin immediately. I'll never forget the moment Agent Morrison called Evelyn Patterson to inform her that her stolen retirement savings had been recovered. The elderly woman broke down sobbing with relief over the phone, explaining that she'd been surviving on crackers and canned soup because she was too proud to ask her children for help after discovering her account was nearly empty. That phone call crystallized something important for me. This wasn't just about catching criminals or protecting a business. It was about defending vulnerable people who'd worked hard their entire lives and deserved to enjoy their retirement with dignity and security. As the FBI agents finished their work and prepared to leave, Agent Morrison pulled me aside. "Ms. Sterling, I want you to know that your investigation made this case possible. Without your evidence, these men would have stolen millions more before we caught them." But even as I savored the satisfaction of seeing justice served, I knew our work was far from finished. Brad's arrest had triggered a massive federal investigation that would eventually expose corruption in financial firms across multiple states. And Sterling Financial Solutions, my grandfather's life work, needed to be rebuilt from the ground up with new leadership, new policies, and a renewed commitment to ethical business practices. The real test would come in the months ahead as I worked to restore the trust and confidence of clients who'd been betrayed by the very people they'd relied on to protect their financial futures. The arrest of Brad Thompson and Marcus Webb sent shockwaves through the financial industry that extended far beyond Sterling Financial Solutions. Within 48 hours of their arrest, FBI field offices in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia had opened parallel investigations into the investment firms where Brad had previously worked. Agent Morrison called me Monday morning with an update that exceeded even my expectations. "Nellie, we've identified 4 additional companies where Brad used the same embezzlement scheme. Cornerstone Investments in Cleveland, Patriot Financial in Pittsburgh, Liberty Wealth Management in Charleston, and Precision Investment Services in Columbus. We're talking about the largest financial fraud case in state history." The scope of the investigation grew exponentially as federal agents discovered that Brad's criminal network included accomplices at each firm who'd helped him identify vulnerable clients and access their accounts. By Wednesday, the FBI had executed search warrants at all 4 companies, resulting in 11 additional arrests, including 3 CFOs, 2 compliance officers, and 6 financial advisors. The media attention was intense and unrelenting. Local television stations camped outside Sterling Financial Solutions, interviewing clients and employees about their experiences with the company. National financial news networks picked up the story, turning it into a cautionary tale about the need for stronger oversight of investment firms. But the coverage also had an unexpected positive effect. Clients who'd been reluctant to come forward about suspicious account activity began calling our offices with reports of unauthorized transactions and missing funds. The FBI established a dedicated hotline for victims of Brad's scheme, and within a week they'd received over 200 calls from elderly investors across 4 states. Each call represented a personal tragedy. Retired school teacher Dorothy Hamilton had lost $68,000 from her pension fund. Former steelworker Frank Rodriguez discovered that his disability benefits had been systematically stolen for 8 months. Widowed grandmother Alice Chen found that the life insurance money she'd planned to leave her grandchildren had vanished from accounts she'd trusted to a corrupt financial advisor. The emotional weight of these stories was overwhelming, but it also strengthened my resolve to rebuild Sterling Financial Solutions into the kind of company grandfather Harold had always envisioned. Every recovered dollar, every restored account, every grateful client represented a victory against the predators who'd tried to destroy everything my family had built. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods Brad had used to avoid detection for so long. He'd carefully researched each target company, identifying weaknesses in their oversight procedures and compliance systems. He'd cultivated relationships with corrupt employees who could provide inside access to client accounts. and he'd developed a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that made the stolen money extremely difficult to trace. Federal prosecutors described it as one of the most organized financial fraud schemes they'd ever encountered. The conspiracy involved forged documents, hacked computer systems, bribed officials, and money laundering operations that spanned 3 countries and involved over 25 separate bank accounts. But Brad's greatest mistake was underestimating the intelligence and determination of his victims. At each company he'd targeted, there were honest employees who'd noticed irregularities and tried to report them. Unfortunately, those employees had been silenced or ignored by corrupt management. Sterling Financial Solutions was the first place where an honest employee, in this case me, had the authority and resources to fight back effectively. The recovered funds began flowing back to victimized clients within 2 weeks of the arrests. The FBI worked with forensic accountants to trace every stolen dollar and return it to its rightful owners. Evelyn Patterson was among the first to receive a check restoring her complete retirement savings, plus interest and penalties paid by the seized assets of the criminals who'd robbed her. I was in my office when Evelyn came to thank me personally. This tiny, dignified woman in her late 70s walked slowly but purposefully to my desk, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "My dear girl," she said, gripping my hands with surprising strength, "you saved my life. I was down to my last $112. I didn't know how I was going to pay for my heart medication next month. My children live so far away, and I was too ashamed to tell them what happened. That conversation changed everything for me. This wasn't just about running a successful business or catching criminals. It was about protecting people like Evelyn, vulnerable seniors who'd worked hard their entire lives and deserved to age with dignity and financial security." Sterling Financial Solutions began implementing revolutionary new client protection policies that went far beyond federal requirements. Every account now required dual authorization for withdrawals over $1,000. Every client received monthly statements with detailed transaction histories, and every employee underwent extensive background checks and ethics training. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by industry observers. Financial publications began featuring Sterling Financial Solutions as a model for ethical business practices. Competitors started adopting our transparency policies, and regulatory agencies used our case as an example of how proper oversight could prevent financial fraud. 6 months after Brad's arrest, Sterling Financial Solutions had not only recovered all the stolen client funds, but had also attracted over 300 new clients who were drawn by our reputation for honesty and transparency. Our assets under management had grown by 47%, and our client satisfaction ratings were the highest in the regional investment industry. But the most satisfying outcome was Brad Thompson's complete downfall. Federal investigators had seized his BMW, his luxury downtown condominium, his boat, and every other asset he'd purchased with stolen money. He was sitting in federal detention awaiting trial on charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. The ripple effects of our investigation continued expanding as federal authorities uncovered evidence of political corruption connected to Brad's scheme. 2 state legislators who'd accepted bribes to weaken financial oversight regulations were arrested, and a grand jury was investigating additional corruption in the state banking commission. What had started as a simple case of workplace embezzlement had become a massive federal investigation that was reshaping the entire regional financial industry. And at the center of it all was Sterling Financial Solutions, transformed from a victim of corruption into a beacon of ethical business leadership. The federal courthouse in downtown Cleveland buzzed with activity as Brad Thompson's trial began on a crisp October morning. Media crews lined the courthouse steps, and the gallery was packed with victims' investigators and legal observers eager to witness the conclusion of one of the largest financial fraud cases in state history. I entered the courthouse wearing a conservative navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio containing 6 months of evidence. As the prosecution's key witness, I would testify about discovering Brad's crimes and coordinating with federal investigators to expose his conspiracy. But more importantly, I would represent the voices of every elderly client who'd been victimized by his greed. Brad's defense attorney, a high-priced criminal lawyer named Harrison Blackwood from a prestigious Chicago firm, had built his strategy around portraying Brad as a scapegoat for a much larger corruption scheme. During opening arguments, Blackwood argued that his client was merely following orders from corrupt executives who were the real masterminds behind the fraud.
"Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Blackwood proclaimed dramatically, "my client Brad Thompson is not the villain in this story. He's a victim himself, manipulated and coerced by powerful corporate executives who needed someone to take the fall for their own criminal enterprise." The prosecution, led by Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Walsh, painted a very different picture. Walsh was a seasoned federal prosecutor with an impressive track record of convicting white-collar criminals. Her opening statement methodically laid out the evidence showing Brad as the architect of a sophisticated fraud scheme that had victimized dozens of elderly investors across multiple states. "The evidence will show that Mr. Thompson was not a victim,"
Walsh declared, making eye contact with each juror. "He was a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable elderly clients, stealing their life savings to fund his own lavish lifestyle. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it without a shred of remorse." My testimony began on the second day of the trial. Walsh guided me through the timeline of events, starting with my decision to work undercover at Sterling Financial Solutions after Grandfather Harold's death. I explained how I'd discovered the fraudulent transactions, documented the evidence, and coordinated with federal investigators to expose the conspiracy. But the most powerful moment came when Walsh asked me to describe the impact on individual victims. I told the jury about Evelyn Patterson, the retired school cafeteria manager, who'd nearly lost her entire life savings. I described Frank Rodriguez, the disabled veteran who'd discovered that his benefits had been stolen to pay for Brad's luxury lifestyle. And I explained how dozens of other elderly clients had been systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted to protect their financial futures. During cross-examination, Harrison Blackwood tried to portray me as a wealthy heiress playing detective games with other people's money. He suggested that I'd manufactured evidence to frame Brad for crimes committed by other people. But his aggressive questioning backfired when I calmly explained that I'd given up a comfortable life to work entry-level jobs for 6 months specifically to understand how regular employees were being affected by the corruption.
"Ms. Sterling,"
Blackwood demanded, "isn't it true that you orchestrated this entire investigation to cover up your own family's financial mismanagement?" "Mr. Blackwood," I replied evenly, "my grandfather built Sterling Financial Solutions on principles of honesty and integrity. When I discovered that those principles were being violated, I had a moral obligation to protect our clients, even if it meant risking everything my family had built." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. FBI forensic accountants traced every stolen dollar from client accounts to Brad's personal bank accounts. Computer forensics experts showed how Brad had hacked into company databases to access confidential client information. And telecommunications specialists presented recorded phone conversations between Brad and his accomplices discussing which elderly clients would be easiest to rob. But Brad's defense team made a critical error during their presentation. While trying to argue that Brad was following orders from corrupt executives, Blackwood accidentally introduced evidence of an even larger conspiracy involving state pension fund manipulation. During his questioning of a character witness, Blackwood asked about Brad's connections to state government officials who'd supposedly pressured him to participate in the fraud scheme. The witness, apparently unaware that his testimony was incriminating, described meetings where Brad had discussed manipulating state pension investments with State Senator William Hayes and Representative Carol Jenkins. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Judge Margaret Sullivan immediately called a sidebar conference with attorneys from both sides. Within hours, FBI agents were executing search warrants at the state capitol building, and by evening both legislators had been arrested on federal corruption charges. The unintended disclosure of political corruption completed Brad's transformation from defendant to the center of a massive criminal enterprise. Federal prosecutors immediately filed additional charges related to the pension fund manipulation, and the judge denied Brad's renewed request for bail. When Brad finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was an exercise in arrogance and self-pity. He blamed everyone except himself for his crimes. He claimed that Marcus Webb had forced him to participate in the embezzlement. He suggested that I had framed him because I was jealous of his success, and he argued that the elderly clients were somehow responsible for their own victimization because they hadn't monitored their accounts closely enough. "These people were careless with their money," Brad testified incredibly. "They signed documents without reading them. They trusted people they barely knew. If they'd been more responsible, none of this would have happened." The jury's reaction was immediate and visceral. Several jurors shook their heads in disgust, and one elderly woman in the front row appeared to be fighting back tears. Brad's complete lack of remorse or accountability destroyed any remaining sympathy the jury might have had for his situation. During my victim impact statement, I spoke not just for myself, but for every client who'd been betrayed by Brad's greed. I described the sleepless nights, the financial anxiety, and the loss of trust that his crimes had created. But I also talked about the resilience and courage of victims like Evelyn Patterson, who'd refused to let Brad's theft destroy their faith in honest people. "Your Honor," I concluded, "Mr. Thompson didn't just steal money. He stole peace of mind from people who'd worked hard their entire lives and deserved to enjoy their retirement with dignity. His crimes have had consequences that will last long after he's served his sentence." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 23 counts. Brad showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his family members in the gallery broke down sobbing. The judge immediately revoked his bail and ordered him held pending sentencing. 3 weeks later, Judge Sullivan sentenced Brad Thompson to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Marcus Webb, who'd cooperated extensively with federal investigators, received a more lenient sentence of 5 years in prison. Both men were ordered to pay complete restitution to all victims, plus penalties and interest. The sentencing hearing concluded with the judge's pointed comments about the broader implications of the case. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Sullivan said sternly, "you violated the sacred trust between financial advisors and their clients. You targeted vulnerable elderly people who depended on you to protect their life savings. Your crimes represent not just theft, but a fundamental betrayal of professional ethics and human decency." As Brad was led away in shackles, I felt a profound sense of closure and justice. The man who'd arrogantly thrown car keys at me 6 months ago was now facing more than a decade in federal prison. But more importantly, every stolen dollar had been recovered and returned to its rightful owners. Sterling Financial Solutions had emerged from the crisis stronger and more respected than ever before. Our client base had grown by 60%, and we'd become the regional leader in ethical investment practices. The company grandfather Harold had built was not just surviving, but thriving under principles of honesty, transparency, and genuine care for client welfare. 6 months after Brad Thompson began serving his 12-year federal prison sentence, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Ethics in Business Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address about transformation leadership and corporate responsibility. The audience of business executives, financial advisors, and regulatory officials represented the kind of industry leadership that could prevent future cases like Brad's systematic fraud. Sterling Financial Solutions had become something extraordinary in the months following the trial. What started as my grandfather's modest investment firm had transformed into the most respected financial services company in the tri-state region. Our client waiting list stretched 3 months long, and investment industry publications regularly featured our innovative ethics policies as models for other firms to follow. The transformation wasn't just about growth and profitability, though those metrics were certainly impressive. We'd increased assets under management by 87%, attracted over 600 new clients, and achieved customer satisfaction ratings that exceeded industry benchmarks by substantial margins. But the real success was measured in restored trust and financial security for people who'd been betrayed by corrupt advisors. Evelyn Patterson had become one of my closest friends and most trusted advisors on client services. At 78 years old, she brought a perspective on financial security that no business school could teach. Her insights about the anxiety elderly clients experience when they can't understand complex investment statements led us to develop the clearest, most comprehensible account reporting system in the industry. People need to know their money is safe. Evelyn often reminded me during our monthly strategy meetings, they need to understand where it's invested and why. Most importantly, they need to trust that you're working for their benefit, not your own. That philosophy became the foundation of everything we built at Sterling Financial Solutions. Every policy, every procedure, every client interaction was designed around the principle that financial advisors are stewards of other people's dreams and futures. Jake Sullivan, the accountant who'd risked his career to help expose Brad's crimes, had been promoted to chief financial officer. His integrity and attention to detail made him the perfect guardian of our clients' financial interests. Under his leadership, we'd implemented oversight systems that exceeded federal requirements and created multiple layers of protection against fraud. We'd also established the Harold Sterling Memorial Scholarship Fund for students studying business ethics and financial services. The scholarship program, funded entirely by recovered assets from Brad's criminal enterprise, was helping train the next generation of ethical financial advisors. 23 students had received scholarships in the first year, with preference given to those from working-class families who understood the value of honest work and financial responsibility. The ripple effects of our investigation continued expanding throughout the industry. Federal legislation introduced after Brad's case had strengthened oversight requirements for investment firms nationwide. State banking commissions had implemented new reporting standards that made it much harder for corrupt advisors to steal from client accounts. And professional associations had revised their ethics codes to include mandatory training on elder financial abuse prevention. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the complete collapse of Brad's criminal network. The investigation that started with his arrest at Sterling Financial Solutions had ultimately led to 47 indictments across 6 states. Federal prosecutors had recovered over $8.3 million in stolen client funds, with every penny returned to victimized investors plus interest and penalties. Brad himself had become a cautionary tale within federal prison. According to Agent Morrison, who maintained contact with all the convicted defendants, Brad remained completely unrepentant about his crimes. He'd been assaulted twice by other inmates who'd learned about his targeting of elderly victims, and he'd spent most of his sentence in protective custody. He still blames everyone except himself, Agent Morrison told me during a recent visit to our offices. He claims the system was corrupt when he arrived, and he was just taking advantage of opportunities that were already there. He'll never understand that he was the corruption. That conversation reinforced my belief that true leadership isn't about commanding authority or accumulating wealth. It's about accepting responsibility for protecting people who depend on you, even when that protection requires personal sacrifice or professional risk. The speaking engagement at the National Ethics Conference was an opportunity to share those lessons with industry leaders who had the power to implement systemic changes. During my presentation, I emphasized that ethical business practices weren't just moral imperatives, but practical necessities for long-term success. When Brad Thompson threw his car keys at my feet and demanded that I park his BMW, I told the audience he was demonstrating the kind of arrogance and entitlement that destroys companies from the inside. He saw other people as servants to his ambition rather than colleagues deserving respect and consideration. The audience responded enthusiastically to my message about servant leadership and ethical stewardship. Several major investment firms approached me afterward about consulting opportunities to help them strengthen their own ethics programs. Regulatory officials expressed interest in using Sterling Financial Solutions as a model for industry reform initiatives, but the most meaningful response came from individual financial advisors who committed to changing how they approached client relationships. A young advisor from Phoenix told me that hearing about Evelyn Patterson's experience had convinced her to specialize in elder financial planning, focusing specifically on protecting vulnerable clients from fraud and abuse. Those personal connections reminded me that real change happens one relationship at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one ethical decision at a time. The systematic reforms and regulatory changes were important, but the true transformation occurred when individual professionals decided to prioritize their clients' welfare over their own immediate gratification. My engagement to Jake Sullivan had been announced the previous month, and we were planning a small ceremony at the Sterling Financial offices with Evelyn Patterson serving as matron of honor. Jake understood that our relationship was built on shared values rather than just romantic attraction. We both believed that business success meant creating value for other people rather than extracting maximum profit for ourselves. The wedding would symbolize not just our personal commitment, but our professional partnership in continuing Grandfather Harold's legacy of ethical leadership. Together, we were building something that would outlast both of us and protect thousands of families for generations to come. As I concluded my conference presentation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that humiliating moment in the parking garage to this platform of industry leadership. The experience had taught me that true power comes not from commanding others, but from empowering them to achieve their own dreams and aspirations. True leadership isn't about the power to command others, but the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. I told the audience, when we choose integrity over convenience, we don't just change our own lives, we create ripples that can transform entire communities. The greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the moral courage to use whatever power we have to protect those who can't protect themselves. Brad Thompson had tried to humiliate me by treating me like hired help, assuming that his expensive car and arrogant attitude gave him authority over other people. Instead, his behavior revealed his own moral bankruptcy and provided the motivation I needed to expose his criminal enterprise. In trying to diminish me, he had actually empowered me to protect hundreds of vulnerable clients and transform an entire industry. That's the lesson I hope everyone takes from this story. Arrogance and entitlement ultimately destroy themselves, while humility and service create lasting positive change. When someone tries to make you feel small, use that energy to build something bigger than they ever imagined possible. The greatest revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong about your capabilities. It's proving them wrong about what really matters in life. Brad thought success meant luxury cars and designer suits, but real success means sleeping peacefully at night, knowing that you've used your talents and opportunities to make other people's lives better than they were before they met you. Every time I walk past that parking space where Brad's BMW used to sit, now occupied by Evelyn Patterson's modest sedan during her volunteer shifts at our client services desk, I'm reminded that true wealth isn't measured in bank account balances or status symbols. It's measured in the trust and gratitude of people whose lives you've touched with kindness, honesty, and genuine care. What experiences have you had with people who tried to make you feel inferior because of your position or circumstances? How did you handle those situations, and what did they teach you about the difference between genuine authority and empty arrogance? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because everyone deserves to feel valued and respected, regardless of their job title or financial status. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up to help others discover it. Subscribe to hear more stories about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. And share this video with someone who might need encouragement to speak up against workplace bullying or financial fraud. Thank you for listening, and remember that your voice matters more than you might think. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to let someone else's arrogance diminish your dignity. Stay strong, stay honest, and never let anyone convince you that you're less valuable than you truly are.